The doors to Courtroom 4B swung open, and the air instantly left the room. Richard Sterling, a man worth $4 billion, didn't just walk in. He strutted, hand in hand with his 24-year-old mistress, Chloe. He was wearing a $7,000 suit and a smile that said he'd already won. On the other side sat Catherine, his wife of 30 years, looking small, tired, and defeated. Everyone expected a massacre. Everyone expected Richard to leave with his empire and his girlfriend, leaving Catherine with pennies. But 10 minutes later, Judge Pence looked up from a dusty ledger, adjusted his glasses, and dropped a single sentence that made the billionaire fall to his knees. You think you know how divorce works? You have no idea. The morning of November 14th was unseasonably cold in Manhattan, but the frost on the windows of the Supreme Court of New York was nothing compared to the atmosphere inside the limousine, parked at the curb. Richard Sterling checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. At 56, he was a specimen of modern pharmaceutical and cosmetic engineering. His hair was a rich, manufactured chestnut. His teeth were blindingly white, and his tailored Brioni suit hid the slight paunch of a man who enjoyed too much scotch and too little cardio. He was the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, a logistics and shipping conglomerate that moved everything from Amazon packages to military hardware. "Richard, baby, are you listening to me?" The voice beside him was high, breathless, and tinged with the rasp of a smoker trying to hide the habit. Chloe Vane, a former Instagram fitness influencer turned interior designer, was picking at a loose thread on her Chanel skirt. It was a skirt Richard had bought her in Paris 3 weeks ago, using the company credit card, a fact his lawyers had warned him against, and a fact he had completely ignored. "I'm listening, Chloe," Richard said, checking his Rolex. "You want the beach house in the Hamptons? I told you, once the ink is dry on this divorce, you can burn the place down and rebuild it with pink marble for all I care. But today you sit there, look pretty, and don't say a word unless spoken to." Chloe pouted, crossing her tanned legs. "I just don't see why she has to be there. Can't your lawyers just crush her?" "Silas is going to do exactly that," Richard smiled, a cruel twisting of lips. "But I want to see her face. Catherine has spent 30 years clinging to my coattails. Today I cut the fabric." Richard opened the door. The paparazzi were already there, a swarm of flashes and shouting voices. He stepped out, turning to offer a hand to Chloe. It was a calculated move. Bringing a mistress to a divorce hearing wasn't just bold. It was a declaration of war. It was Richard telling the world and his wife that he feared no consequences. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere shifted from chaotic to sterile. The hallway leading to Courtroom 4B was lined with marble and mahogany. Waiting on a wooden bench near the doors was a solitary figure. Catherine Sterling. She didn't look like the wife of a billionaire. She wore a grey wool coat that had seen better decades. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, practical bun, and she was reading a paperback book with a cracked spine. She wore no jewelry, not even her wedding ring. Richard slowed his pace, enjoying the contrast. He felt like a lion stalking a wounded gazelle. "Hello, Catherine," Richard boomed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Catherine didn't jump. She slowly marked her page, closed the book, and looked up. Her eyes were blue, pale, and unreadable. "Richard, you brought company." "Chloe," the younger woman snapped, clinging to Richard's arm. "My name is Chloe." Catherine offered a faint, almost sad smile. "I know, dear. I saw the receipts for the bracelet you're wearing. Cartier, wasn't it?" "October 12th, the day of my mother's funeral." Richard stiffened. "Don't start the guilt trip, Catherine. You signed the prenup in '94. You get the townhouse in Queens and $50,000 a year. Silas has the papers." "We'll see," Catherine said softly. She stood up. She was shorter than Chloe, but there was a rigidity to her spine that made her seem formidable. "Is your lawyer here, or is he running late counting your billable hours?" "Mr. Grimm is already inside," Richard sneered, "prepping the slaughter." Catherine nodded and turned to the courtroom doors. As she pushed them open, Richard noticed something that unsettled him for a fraction of a second. She wasn't shaking. Her hands were steady. "She's bluffing," Richard whispered to himself. "She has nothing." He took Chloe's hand and marched into the arena. The courtroom was packed. Divorce hearings for public figures usually were sealed, but Richard had insisted on transparency. He wanted the stock market to see that Sterling Dynamics was in firm control. He wanted the shareholders to know that his ex-wife would have no claim on the voting shares. At the plaintiff's table sat Silas Grimm. Grimm was a legend in New York family law, a man known as the Thresher. He was bald, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and had a reputation for making grown men cry on the stand. He had a stack of files in front of him, 3 feet high. "Richard," Grimm nodded, not standing up. "Sit, let's get this over with. The judge is Arthur Pence." Richard frowned as he sat down. "Pence? Never heard of him. I thought we paid for influence." "Pence is semi-retired," Grimm whispered, shuffling papers. "Pulled from the reserve list because Judge Kaplan had a heart attack last night. It's fine. Pence is a stickler for paperwork. Our paperwork is immaculate. Catherine has... well, look." Richard looked across the aisle. Catherine was sitting alone at the defense table. There was no team of associates, no paralegals, just an elderly woman with wild grey hair, wearing a tweed jacket that looked like it smelled of mothballs. She was rummaging through a canvas tote bag, pulling out a thermos and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "That's her lawyer?" Richard stifled a laugh. "Who is she? A librarian?" "Beatrice Wycliffe," Grimm said, his voice losing some of its confidence. "I haven't seen her in 20 years. I thought she was dead." "Is she good?" "She was annoying," Grimm grunted. "She does pro bono work for widows, small claims, estates. She's irrelevant, Richard. She doesn't understand corporate structuring. She won't understand the shell companies." "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Arthur Pence walked in. He was a small man, seemingly shrinking into his robes. He carried a cane and moved with agonizing slowness. He climbed the steps to the bench, sat down, and peered over the rim of the podium. "All right," Pence wheezed into the microphone. "Sterling versus Sterling. Let's keep the theatrics to a minimum. I missed my breakfast." Grimm stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, Silas Grimm, representing Mr. Richard Sterling. We are moving for a summary judgment based on the pre-nuptial agreement signed in 1994. The terms are clear. The assets in question, specifically Sterling Dynamics and its subsidiaries, are sole property of Mr. Sterling. Mrs. Sterling waived all claims to business assets in exchange for a fixed stipend." "I see," Judge Pence mumbled, flipping through a file. "And the defense?" Beatrice Wycliffe stood up. She didn't look at the judge. She was busy trying to unscrew her fountain pen. "Beatrice Wycliffe for Mrs. Sterling, Your Honor. We contest the validity of the prenup." "On what grounds?" Grimm shot back, aggressive. "Duress? Incompetence? It's been 30 years. "Fraud," Beatrice said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a strange weight. She finally got the pen cap off. "And misidentification of assets." Richard leaned over to Grimm. "What is she talking about?" "Desperation," Grimm whispered back. "She's fishing." "Mr. Grimm," the judge said, "call your first witness. Let's establish the assets." Grimm called Richard to the stand. This was the rehearsed part. Richard walked up, swore on the Bible and sat down, projecting the image of a benevolent titan of industry. "Mr. Sterling," Grimm began, pacing the floor. "You founded Sterling Dynamics in 1992, correct?" "I did," Richard said. "In a garage in New Jersey. Just me and a van." "And at that time, was Catherine Sterling involved in the business?" "No," Richard lied smoothly. "Catherine she was a homemaker. She kept the apartment tidy. She had no head for logistics. I built the routing algorithms. I secured the loans." In the gallery, Chloe smirked and whispered to a friend she had snuck in, "He's so powerful." At the defense table, Catherine stared at her hands. She remembered 1992 differently. She remembered Richard crying on the kitchen floor because he couldn't understand the tax codes. She remembered her taking the night shift at the diner to pay for the gas in the van. She remembered her father, a retired math teacher, writing the code for the first routing system, code Richard later copyrighted in his own name. "And regarding the restructuring in 2015, Grimm continued, "you moved the primary holdings to a trust in Nevis. Is Mrs. Sterling a beneficiary of that trust?" "She is not," Richard said. "It is a business trust." "Thank you. Your witness?" Grimm sat down, looking smug. Beatrice Wycliffe stood up slowly. She picked up a single piece of paper. It looked yellowed, old. She walked toward Richard, her shoes squeaking slightly on the floor. "Mr. Sterling," Beatrice began, her voice sounding like a grandmother asking for a cup of tea. "You said you founded the company in 1992, but the incorporation papers, they list a principal investor. Do you remember who that was?" Richard rolled his eyes. "My uncle lent me $5,000. I paid him back with interest in 93. "Not your uncle," Beatrice said. She adjusted her glasses. "I'm looking at a loan document from a Halloway Holdings, dated January 1992, for $50,000. Richard froze. The room went silent. Halloway. That was Catherine's maiden name. I don't recall that," Richard stammered. "You don't recall $50,000? Beatrice asked, feigning surprise. "That is a lot of money for a garage startup. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $100,000 today. Where did that money come from, Richard?" Richard looked at Catherine. She was finally looking at him. Her eyes were hard. "It was inheritance," Richard said quickly. "Catherine's father died. She gave me the money. It was a gift." "A gift?" Beatrice turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I have here a promissory note signed by Richard Sterling. It doesn't say gift, it says exchange for equity. Clause 4A. In exchange for seed capital, the lender retains 50% ownership of all future entities derived from this initial investment." "Objection!" Grimm shouted, jumping up. "I have never seen this document. This is an ambush." "It was in the discovery box sent to your office 3 months ago, Mr. Grimm," Beatrice said calmly. "Perhaps if you had looked past the first layer of files, you would have found it. It was filed under history." Richard's face turned red. "That paper is ancient. It was superseded by the prenup." "Ah, the prenup," Beatrice smiled. It was a shark's smile. "The prenup applies to marital assets. But if Sterling Dynamics is a partnership formed before the marriage, then Catherine isn't asking for half of your money, Richard. She's asking for her half of the company." The courtroom murmured. Chloe stopped, checking her phone. "This is ridiculous," Richard hissed at the judge. "I built this empire. She sat at home." "We will see," Judge Pence said, scribbling a note. "Objection overruled. Continue, Ms. Wycliffe." Beatrice turned back to Richard. "Now, let's talk about the Aurora Shell Company you established in the Cayman Islands last year. The one you used to buy the yacht Ms. Vane is currently listed as the captain of. Richard felt a bead of sweat roll down his back. How did she know about Aurora? I don't know what you're talking about, Richard lied. It was a perjury trap, and he had just stepped into it with both feet. Beatrice walked back to her table and picked up a thick binder. Judge, I'd like to submit Evidence B, the bank records for Aurora Holdings, and the signature card for the account. She turned to Richard. Richard, who is the registered signatory for Aurora? My lawyers handle that. Is it you? No. Is it Mr. Grimm? No. Is it... Beatrice paused for dramatic effect, looking directly at the mistress in the second row. Is it Miss Chloe Vane? Chloe blinked, looking around nervously. I refuse to answer regarding private corporate matters, Richard blustered. The signatory, Beatrice said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming steel, is C. Sterling. You assumed, didn't you, Richard? You saw C. Sterling on the old banking forms from the 90s, and just kept using the same authorization to hide the money, assuming it meant you as the controller. But you forgot something. What? Richard snapped. Your middle name is James, Beatrice said. Catherine's middle name is... wait for it. Sterling. She was born Catherine Sterling Halloway. Her mother's maiden name was Sterling, a coincidental relation from a distant branch. Beatrice slammed the binder shut. You didn't open that account, Richard. You couldn't have. Because the ID used to verify it was Catherine's passport. Silence. Absolute silence. Richard looked at his lawyer. Grimm looked sick. I didn't, Richard stammered. I moved the money digitally. Using an authorization key linked to her identity, Beatrice said. Which means, legally speaking, you didn't hide your money from your wife, Richard. You deposited $400 million into her private bank account. The silence in courtroom 4B was broken by the sharp clack of Judge Pence's gavel. Order, he grumbled, though nobody was speaking. The room was paralyzed by the revelation that Richard Sterling had accidentally funneled a fortune into an account legally tied to his wife. Beatrice Wycliffe didn't give Richard time to recover. Your Honor, I would like to call a hostile witness. Ms. Chloe Vane. Chloe jumped in her seat, clutching her designer purse. She looked at Richard, wide-eyed. Richard, pale and sweating, gave a stiff nod. Go, he whispered harshly. Just deny everything. Chloe walked to the stand. She looked like she was walking a runway, chin up, defiant. She sat down, crossed her legs, and glared at Catherine. Miss Vane, Beatrice began, leaning against the defense table. You are currently listed as a consultant for Sterling Dynamics, earning a salary of $250,000 a year. Could you describe your duties? Chloe smoothed her hair. I handle lifestyle management, corporate aesthetics. I ensure the brand image is modern. I see, Beatrice said. And does lifestyle management include the use of the company penthouse in Tribeca, the one you moved into 4 months ago? Richard, Mr. Sterling, said it was a perk of the job, Chloe sniffed. And the car? The Bentley Continental GT? A company vehicle. And the jewelry? Beatrice walked closer. Specifically, the 12-carat diamond necklace you wore to the Met Gala last week. Valued at $300,000? Chloe touched her neck instinctively, though she wasn't wearing it today. That was a gift, personal, from Richard. Beatrice turned to the jury box, which was empty, as this was a bench trial, then back to the judge. A gift. Interesting, because I have the receipt here. Beatrice held up a document. The necklace was purchased from Harry Winston on November 2nd. The payment method? A wire transfer from Aurora Holdings. Richard closed his eyes. He knew what was coming. "Ms. Vane," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "As we established 10 minutes ago, Aurora Holdings is an account identified by the passport of Catherine Sterling, which means Richard didn't buy you that necklace." Beatrice pointed a shaking finger at Catherine. "She did." Chloe laughed nervously. "That's ridiculous. Richard bought it." "Legally," Beatrice interrupted. "Legally, Richard committed wire fraud to access funds he didn't have authorization for, to buy an asset for an employee. But here is the twist, Miss Vane. Since the money came from an account under Catherine's identity, and since you accepted it," Beatrice picked up a menacing-looking law book, "you are currently in possession of stolen property, or, if we want to be generous, you are in possession of a loan. Catherine never authorized a gift. Therefore, she is calling in her debt." Chloe stood up, furious. "I'm not giving it back. It's mine." "It is not yours," Judge Pence interjected, his voice surprisingly sharp. "Ms. Vane, if the funds are traced to Mrs. Sterling's verified identity, that jewelry is evidence. Sit down." Beatrice wasn't done. "It gets worse, Miss Vane. The penthouse, the lease is in the name of Aurora Holdings. The Bentley, title held by Aurora Holdings. You see, Richard was so desperate to hide his assets from the divorce court that he put everything into a basket he thought was secret. But he put your life into his wife's basket." Chloe looked at Richard. The adoration in her eyes was gone, replaced by panic. "Richard, what is she talking about? Do I own the apartment or not?" Richard put his head in his hands. "No," Beatrice answered for him. "Catherine owns the apartment. You are trespassing. And as of this morning, Catherine has issued an eviction notice. You have 24 hours to vacate." "You can't do that," Chloe shrieked. "I'm pregnant." The courtroom gasped. The reporters in the back row started typing furiously. Richard's head snapped up. "What?" "I was going to tell you tonight," Chloe sobbed, playing to the crowd. "I'm carrying his heir. You can't kick a pregnant woman out on the street." Catherine, who had been silent as a stone statue, finally moved. She stood up. She looked at Chloe's stomach, then at Richard's face. There was no anger in her expression, only pity. "He didn't tell you, did he?" Catherine said softly. Chloe wiped her eyes. "Tell me what?" "Richard had a vasectomy in 1998, Catherine said, "after our son died." The heir left the room for the second time that day. Richard looked at Chloe, his face turning a dark shade of purple. You said you were on the pill, and... Wait, if I'm sterile, Chloe stammered. "Doctors can be wrong. Miracles happen." "Not that kind of miracle," Richard roared, standing up. "Who is it? Is it the tennis instructor? The one you said was gay? Order!" Judge Pence banged his gavel so hard the handle cracked. "Mr. Sterling, sit down! Ms. Vane, step down! This is a court of law, not a reality show." Chloe fled the stand, weeping, but nobody looked at her with sympathy. They were all looking at Richard Sterling, a man who had just found out his mistress was a fraud, his assets were compromised, and his wife held the keys to his entire existence. "Recess!" Judge Pence yelled. 1 hour. Fix this mess, Mr. Grimm, or I will fix it for you." The hallway outside the courtroom was buzzing, but the corner where Richard and Silas Grimm stood was a vacuum of tension. "You said she was a librarian," Richard hissed, grabbing his lawyer by the lapel. "You said she was irrelevant." "She sandbagged us," Grimm said, wiping sweat from his bald head. "The Aurora account. Richard, how could you be so stupid? You used her passport." "Why?" "Because mine was expired," Richard shouted, "and I needed to move the cash before the quarter ended. I thought it didn't matter. We were married. What's hers is mine, right?" "Not in a limited liability shell company structure," Grimm snapped. You effectively gifted her the liquidity of the entire offshore operation. If she wants to, she can freeze Sterling Dynamics payroll tomorrow. She owns the operating capital. Richard leaned against the marble wall, feeling his heart hammer against his ribs. Fix it. Offer a settlement. Give her 10 million. 20. Richard, Grimm said grimly. She has 400 million in that account. She doesn't want your money. She wants your blood. Across the hallway, Catherine was sitting on a bench, sipping tea from her thermos. Beatrice Wycliffe was next to her, eating a ham sandwich. They looked like two old friends on a park bench, completely unbothered by the chaos they had unleashed. Richard straightened his tie. He needed to take control. He was a negotiator. He had broken unions. He had crushed competitors. He could handle one bitter housewife. He walked over to them. Beatrice stopped chewing but didn't look up. "Catherine," Richard said. His voice was lower now, devoid of the arrogance from the morning. "Can we talk? Alone?" Catherine looked up. "I have no secrets from my counsel." "Fine," Richard said. "Look, you've made your point. You embarrassed me. You exposed Chloe. Congratulations. But let's be real. You don't know how to run a shipping empire. You don't know the suppliers. You don't know the government contracts. If you freeze the accounts, the stock tanks, the company dies. You lose everything too." Catherine set her tea down. "I don't care." "Don't be childish," Richard snapped. "There are 4,000 employees." "I know," Catherine said. "I know their names. I send Christmas cards to the warehouse managers. You don't. You send generic emails signed by a bot." She stood up, closing the distance between them. "You think I want the money, Richard? I lived on rice and beans while you bought suits. I stayed when you missed our anniversaries. I stayed when you missed my mother's funeral to play golf. I stayed because I thought, deep down, we were still partners." She took a step closer. "But then you brought her into my house. You let her sleep in my bed. And you told the world I was a gold digger who contributed nothing." Catherine reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small, black notebook. It was tattered, held together by rubber bands. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. Richard stared at it. It looked vaguely familiar. "This is the Black Book," Catherine said, "from 1993 to 2005. The years you were drinking with clients, and I was running the logistics from the kitchen table." "So?" Richard scoffed. "It's old notes. It's the IP," Beatrice interjected, speaking with her mouth full. "Intellectual property." Richard froze. "The routing algorithm," Catherine said. "The Sterling method that made us billions? The code that optimizes shipping lanes? You didn't write it, Richard. You can barely use Excel." I conceptualized it." "No," Catherine said. "I wrote it in this notebook, and I never assigned the copyright to the company." Richard felt the floor tilt. "That's impossible. Everything created during the marriage is community property." "Not works of art," Beatrice corrected, "or literary works, or code written prior to formal employment contracts. Since you never hired Catherine, never paid her a wage, and never signed an IP transfer agreement, she owns the source code." Catherine tapped the notebook against Richard's chest. "I can shut down Sterling Dynamics not by freezing the bank accounts, Richard. I can shut it down by revoking the license to use my software. I can turn your logistics empire into a fleet of trucks that don't know where to go." Richard stared at her. For the first time in 30 years, he saw her. He didn't see the quiet wife. He saw the titan he should have feared. "What do you want?" Richard whispered. His voice was broken. Catherine smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. "I want you to go back into that courtroom," she said, and I want you to admit it. All of it. The fraud, the lies, the fact that I built this company. And if I do? Then maybe, Catherine said, turning away. Maybe I won't send the IRS the file I have on your Cayman Island tax evasion. Yet. Mr. Sterling, the bailiff called from the door. We're back in session. Richard looked at the courtroom door. It looked like the mouth of a shark. He looked at Catherine's back. He had no choice. He walked back inside, but this time he didn't strut. He dragged his feet, a man walking to his own execution. Richard Sterling sat in the witness box for the second time that day, but the man who sat there now bore little resemblance to the titan who had entered the building that morning. His tie was loosened. His face was a mask of grey, clammy zakin. His hands, usually so expressive when he was closing a deal, gripped the wooden railing until his knuckles turned white. Mr. Sterling, Beatrice Wycliffe said, standing in the center of the room. She didn't need the microphone. Her voice was clear, sharp, and unavoidable. We are going to correct the record. For 30 years, the narrative of Sterling Dynamics has been the story of a genius businessman pulling himself up by his bootstraps. Is that narrative accurate? Richard looked at his lawyer, Silas Grimm. Grimm was staring at the ceiling, effectively resigning from the fight. He knew about the tax evasion file. He knew there was no defense against prison time if Catherine released it. No, Richard croaked. I can't hear you, Beatrice said, cupping her ear. No, Richard said, louder. It's incomplete. Let's complete it, Beatrice said. She held up the tattered black notebook. Exhibit C, the original source code for the logistics algorithm, the heartbeat of your empire. The reason your company is worth $4 billion instead of being a failed delivery service in New Jersey. Who wrote the code, Richard? Richard looked at Catherine. She was watching him, her face calm, almost serene. She wasn't gloating. She was simply waiting for the truth to catch up to the lie. Catherine wrote it, Richard whispered. A gasp rippled through the gallery. The reporters were typing so fast it sounded like a hailstorm. Catherine wrote it, Beatrice repeated. And did you pay her for it? No. Did you acknowledge her contribution in the annual reports? No. Did you, in fact, tell the board of directors in 2005 that you stayed up for 3 nights straight to crack the routing problem, a story that became legendary in Forbes magazine? Richard closed his eyes. Yes, I said that. So, Beatrice walked closer, her heels clicking like gunshots on the floor. You stole her intellectual property. You stole her inheritance to fund the startup. You stole her identity to hide your illegal assets. And then, when you were done using her, you tried to discard her like a wrapper. Beatrice turned to the judge. Your Honor, we are not asking for alimony. Alimony is for a dependent spouse. Catherine Sterling is not a dependent. She is the architect. She is the financier. And she is the victim of grand larceny on a corporate scale. Mr. Grimm? Judge Pence asked, looking over his spectacles. Do you have a redirect? Silas Grimm stood up slowly. He put his papers into his briefcase. No questions, Your Honor. The defense rests. Richard looked at his lawyer in horror. Silas? You're giving up? I'm cutting my losses, Richard, Grimm muttered, loud enough for the front row to hear. I don't represent criminals who lie to me about felony tax evasion. You're on your own. Grimm walked out of the courtroom. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him, sealing Richard's fate. But the drama wasn't over. From the back of the room, a shrill voice cut through the tension. He promised me. It was Chloe. She was standing in the aisle, mascara running down her face, looking frantic. He promised me $10 million, she screamed, pointing at Richard. He signed a contract with me, a companionship agreement. It's in his safe." Judge Pence banged his gavel. "Bailiff, remove that woman." "No, you have to listen." Chloe was hysterical now. "He told me the wife was stupid. He told me she was a doormat. He said we would take her money and move to Monaco. I did my part. I played the mistress. I deserve my payment." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Chloe had just admitted to a conspiracy. Catherine stood up. She turned to face the young woman who had tormented her. "Chloe," Catherine said gently, "there is no money. The 10 million he promised you? It was going to come from the Aurora account. My account." Chloe froze as two bailiffs grabbed her arms. "And," Catherine added, "regarding the companionship agreement, I wouldn't worry about enforcing it. I think you'll be too busy dealing with the charges for grand theft regarding the diamond necklace." "What?" Chloe shrieked as she was dragged toward the doors. "Richard, do something!" Richard didn't look at her. He was staring at the table, a broken man. Judge Pence watched the doors close on the screaming mistress. He adjusted his robe, took a long sip of water, and looked down at Richard Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, get off the stand. Sit at your table. I am ready to issue my ruling." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Every eye was fixed on Judge Arthur Pence. He was writing something on a notepad, his pen scratching loudly. He did this for 2 agonizing minutes. Finally, he looked up. "In 30 years on the bench," Judge Pence began, his voice raspy but authoritative, "I have seen greed, I have seen betrayal, I have seen men hide money in mattresses, in cryptocurrency, and in the walls of their houses. But I have never seen a case of hubris quite like this." He looked at Richard. "Mr. Sterling, you built a glass castle on a foundation of sand, and you handed the sledgehammer to your wife. You assumed she was weak because she was quiet. You assumed she was unintelligent because she was kind. That was your fatal error." Richard slumped in his chair. "The prenuptial agreement of 1994, the judge continued, "is hereby declared null and void, ab initio, from the beginning. It was signed under fraudulent pretenses, as the defendant failed to disclose that the primary asset, Sterling Dynamics, was already a partnership funded by the plaintiff." The reporters gasped. Voiding a prenup was rare. Voiding one involving billions was historic. "Furthermore," Pence said, flipping a page, "the court recognizes the Aurora Holdings account as the sole property of Catherine Sterling, as it is registered to her legal identity. Mr. Sterling, you are ordered to repay the $400 million you deposited there, plus interest. However, since you likely do not have that liquidity without liquidating the company, I am going to make a structural adjustment." The judge took off his glasses. "The court finds that the intellectual property, the Sterling Method Code, belongs to Catherine Sterling. Without this code, the company has no value. Therefore, to satisfy the debt and the division of assets, I am awarding ownership of Sterling Dynamics to the plaintiff." Silence fell. Absolute, heavy silence. Richard's mouth fell open. You can't. I am the CEO." "Not anymore," Judge Pence said. "I am stripping you of your majority shareholder status. I am awarding 60% of the voting stock to Catherine Sterling. You will retain 40%, which will be immediately placed in a blind trust to satisfy your legal fees and potential IRS penalties." "You're giving her my company?" Richard shouted, standing up. "She's a housewife. She can't run a global logistics firm." "She wrote the code that runs it, Richard," the judge snapped. "She has been running it from the shadows for 20 years, while you were busy buying necklaces for Instagram models. I suspect the shareholders will be relieved to have a competent adult at the helm." Judge Pence turned to Catherine. Mrs. Sterling, you are now the majority owner and chairwoman of the board of Sterling Dynamics. Do you accept this judgment? Catherine stood up. She smoothed her grey wool coat. She looked at Richard, who was shaking, tears of rage in his eyes. I accept, Your Honour, she said. Then it is so ordered, the judge said. And Mr. Sterling, I am forwarding the transcript of today's proceedings to the district attorney's office. They might have some questions about your tax filings and your creative use of passport identification. I suggest you find a new lawyer. Fast. Bang. The gavel came down. Richard collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He had walked in with $4 billion and a mistress. He was leaving with a minority stake he couldn't touch, a criminal investigation, and no one to drive him home. Catherine gathered her books. She picked up the tattered black notebook, the source of all her power, and put it back in her tote bag. She walked toward the exit. As she passed Richard's table, he grabbed the edge of her coat. Catherine, he sobbed, please, I have nowhere to go. The penthouse. Chloe, the accounts are frozen. Catherine, we were married for 30 years. Please. Catherine stopped. She looked down at his hand on her coat, then up at his tear-streaked face. You're right, Richard, she said softly. We were married for 30 years, and for the last 10, you treated me like a piece of furniture. You wanted a trophy wife? You should have bought a trophy. They don't have memories. She gently pried his fingers off her coat. You have the townhouse in Queens, she said, echoing his words from the morning. And $50,000 a year. It's more than you started with. She turned and walked out the double doors. Outside, the hallway was a frenzy. Cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust in her face. Mrs. Sterling! Mrs. Sterling! What are you going to do now that you own the company? A reporter shouted. Are you going to fire the board? Are you going to sell? Catherine stopped. She looked into the camera lens, her blue eyes sharp and clear. First, she said, a small smile playing on her lips, I'm going to go home and finish my book. Then, tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., I am going to walk into my office, and I am going to fire the entire executive suite who helped my husband hide his assets. And Richard? Another reporter yelled. What about Richard? Catherine paused. She looked back at the closed courtroom doors. Richard who? She asked. And then she walked away into the cold Manhattan afternoon, leaving the chaos behind her. The morning sun hit the glass facade of the Sterling Dynamics Tower, turning the 40-story skyscraper into a pillar of blinding fire. For 30 years, this building had been a monument to Richard Sterling. It was designed to intimidate. The lobby was all black marble and sharp angles. The air always smelled of ozone and expensive cologne. It was a place where weakness was not permitted. But at 8:15 a.m. on November 15th, the atmosphere inside the lobby was different. It crackled with a frantic, nervous energy. Security guards whispered into their earpieces. Receptionists refreshed news feeds on their hidden phones. The ticker tape above the reception desk, which usually displayed the company's stock price in bold green, was flashing a trading halted warning. The revolving doors spun, and the murmurs died instantly. Catherine Sterling walked in. She wasn't the grey, invisible woman from the courtroom. She wore a suit of midnight blue, tailored to a razor's edge, a stark contrast to the shapeless wool coats Richard had preferred she wear. Her hair was loose, framing a face that no longer held a trace of apology. Beside her walked Beatrice Wycliffe, who had traded her moth-eaten cardigan for a sharp blazer, though she still carried her battered canvas tote bag like a weapon of war. Mrs. Sterling, the head of security, a burly man named O'Connell, stepped forward. He looked uncertain, his hand hovering near his belt. We weren't expecting you until the lawyers finalized the transfer. The transfer is final, Mr. O'Connell, Catherine said, not breaking her stride. She didn't stop to show ID. She didn't need to. And remove the Mrs. from your vocabulary. It's Miss Halloway from now on. Is the elevator ready? Yes, ma'am. I locked out the other cars. Straight to 50. Thank you, O'Connell. And check your bank account later today. The Christmas bonus Richard cancelled last year? I'm reinstating it with interest. O'Connell's jaw dropped. He straightened up, snapping a salute that was only half joking. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. As the elevator doors closed, sealing them in a capsule of silence, Beatrice chuckled. You just bought the loyalty of the entire security team for less than the cost of one of Richard's golf trips. Loyalty is cheap when people are used to being treated like dirt, Catherine said, watching the floor numbers climb. Now comes the hard part. The doors opened on the 50th floor, the executive suite. It was a ghost town. The secretaries' desks were empty, likely because the staff was hiding in the break room, terrified of the purge. Catherine walked past the empty cubicles, her heels sinking into the plush carpet. She approached the double mahogany doors of the boardroom. She could hear voices inside, shouting. She can't just take over. It's a logistics company, not a bakery. That was Preston, the CFO, a man who wore suspenders and thought he was the smartest person in any room. The judge's ruling is clear, Preston. She owns 60%. We serve at her pleasure. That was Nolan, the general counsel. At least someone could read. Catherine placed her hand on the brass handle. She took a breath, not of fear, but of anticipation. She pushed the doors open. The conversation died. 12 men in Italian suits froze. At the head of the table sat Richard's chair, a monstrosity of black leather that looked more like a throne than office furniture. It was empty. Catherine walked to the window, placing her bag on the side table. She looked out at the city, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Good morning, gentlemen, she said, still facing the window. I see you haven't started packing. Preston stood up, adjusting his glasses. Catherine, excuse me, Mrs. Sterling. Let's be reasonable. We understand there was a domestic dispute. But this is a Fortune 500 company. The markets are panicked. You need to issue a statement that Richard is remaining as a consultant. We need his face. Catherine turned around slowly. Her eyes were like ice. His face? The face that is currently splashed across every tabloid in the country for fraud and perjury? That face? It's a PR blip, Preston insisted, waving a hand dismissively. We can spin it. But you? No offense, Catherine, but you don't know the difference between a bill of lading and a balance sheet. Catherine walked to the table. She didn't sit. She stood over Preston, casting a long shadow over his notepad. A bill of lading is a legal document between the shipper and carrier, detailing the type, quantity, and destination of goods, she recited perfectly. A balance sheet is a financial statement reporting a company's assets, liabilities, and shareholder equity. Speaking of liabilities, let's talk about the Omega shipping lane. Preston's face went pale. What? The Omega lane, Catherine repeated. The route Richard set up 3 years ago to bypass customs in Jakarta. The one that saves us 15% on fuel, but costs us $2 million a year in bribes to local officials. The room went deathly silent. This was highly classified illegal activity. How do you know about that? Preston whispered. Because I noticed the discrepancy in the fuel audits in 2023, Catherine said. I asked Richard about it. He told me not to worry my pretty little head. So I hacked his email. She reached into Beatrice's tote bag and pulled out a thick blue folder. She threw it onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of Preston. "That folder contains the wire transfers authorized by you, Preston. You didn't just sign off on the bribes. You skimmed 2% off the top for a shell company in Delaware called P-Squared Consulting. Did you think I wouldn't check the vendor list?" Preston collapsed into his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "You're fired," Catherine said simply. "Security is waiting in the hall. If you cooperate, I won't hand that folder to the FBI. If you make a scene, you'll be in handcuffs before you hit the lobby." Preston grabbed his briefcase and ran. He didn't look back. Catherine looked at the remaining 11 men. They were staring at her with a mixture of terror and awe. "Anyone else want to test my knowledge of the company?" she asked. Nobody moved. "Good," Catherine said. "Nolan, you're the general counsel. Draft a press release. Sterling Dynamics announces a new era of transparency. We are auditing all shipping routes for compliance. And get the union rep on the phone, Arthur Cobb. I want him here in an hour." "Cobb," Nolan stammered. "Richard has been at war with Cobb for a decade. Cobb threatened to burn the warehouses down." "Richard was at war," Catherine corrected. "I am making peace. Call him." An hour later, the office was calmer, but the tension was still thick. Beatrice was setting up a new laptop at the head of the table. Catherine was reviewing contracts, slashing through paragraphs with a red pen. The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Halloway?" It was O'Connell from the lobby. His voice sounded strained. "Go ahead, O'Connell." "We have a situation. Mr. Sterling is here." Catherine's pen stopped. "Is he?" "He's demanding access. He's screaming that he owns the building. He tried to push past the turnstiles and, well, we had to restrain him. He's causing a scene, Ma'am. The press is outside filming it." Catherine closed her eyes for a second. She could picture it. Richard, in his rumpled suit from yesterday, red-faced, screaming at the people he used to ignore. It was pathetic. It was tragic. "Let him up," Catherine said. "Ma'am." Beatrice looked up, concerned. "Is that wise?" "Let him up," Catherine repeated. "Security escort. But bring him to the boardroom." 10 minutes later, the doors opened. Richard Sterling didn't strut. He was dragged. 2 guards held his arms as he thrashed. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 24 hours because he hadn't. His shirt was untucked. He had lost a cufflink. His eyes were wild. "Get your hands off me!" Richard shouted as they released him. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the conference table. He looked up and saw Catherine. She was sitting in his chair. His chair. The sight seemed to break something in him. "You!" he spat. "You thief! This is my office. My name is on the building." "Actually," Catherine said, gesturing to the window where a crew was already rappelling down the side of the glass. "They are removing the Richard from the signage as we speak. It will just be Sterling Dynamics by lunch." My name. Richard fell into one of the guest chairs. He looked around the room, expecting to see his allies. He saw only empty chairs and Beatrice Wycliffe eating a bagel. "Catherine, stop this," Richard pleaded, his voice shifting from anger to a desperate whine. "You proved your point. You won, okay? You won. But you can't run this place. You need me. Who's going to handle the investors? Who's going to handle Cobb and the union thugs?" "Mr. Cobb is on his way up," Catherine said calmly. "And the investors have already sent flowers. Apparently they prefer a CEO who isn't under investigation for tax fraud." Richard put his head in his hands. "I have nothing, Catherine. The accounts are frozen. The penthouse locks were changed. I spent the night in a 24-hour diner. I had to beg a waiter for a coffee." He looked up, tears streaming down his face. "I'm your husband. Doesn't that mean anything?" Catherine stood up. She walked around the table until she was standing right in front of him. She looked down, her face unreadable. "It meant everything," she said softly. "For 30 years, it meant everything. I gave you my inheritance. I gave you my mind. I gave you my life. I raised our son. And when we lost him, I grieved alone because you were too busy building this." She gestured to the opulent room. "You didn't build a company, Richard. You built a monument to your own ego. And you sacrificed me to do it. You didn't just cheat on me with Chloe. You erased me. You convinced yourself I was nothing." She leaned in close. "You asked if being my husband means anything. Today? No. Today, you are just a liability I am writing off." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a single silver key. "This is the key to the townhouse in Queens," she said, placing it on the table. "It's empty. The heat works. The water works. There is a checking account with $50,000 in your name. It's a fresh start, Richard. It's exactly what you gave me in 1992. Let's see if you can build an empire from a garage a second time." Richard stared at the key. It was a humiliating mercy. "I can't go back to Queens," he whispered. "I'm Richard Sterling." "Not anymore," Catherine said. She turned her back on him. "O'Connell, please escort Mr. Sterling out of the building, and make sure he takes the freight elevator. We don't want to upset the clients in the lobby." Richard grabbed the key. It was all he had left. He stood up, trembling, and let the guards lead him away. At the door, he looked back one last time. He saw Catherine sitting at the head of the table, already on the phone, commanding the room with a natural authority he had never possessed. She didn't look back. The doors closed. 5 minutes later, the door opened again. A massive man in a flannel shirt and work boots walked in. Arthur Cobb, the head of the dockworkers' union. He looked ready for a brawl. "All right, Sterling," Cobb boomed, not looking at who was in the chair. "I heard you fired the suits. That don't mean I'm going to go easy on you. We want the 15% raise or we strike at midnight." Catherine spun the chair around. "Hello, Arthur," she said. Cobb froze. "Mrs. Sterling, where's Richard?" "Richard is retired," Catherine said, "and the 15% raise is rejected." Cobb's face turned red. "Then we walk." "I'm rejecting it because it's too low," Catherine said. She slid a paper across the table. "I've reviewed the profit margins from the automation upgrades. We can afford 20% plus full dental coverage for the night shift. In exchange, I want a guarantee of 0 stoppage for 3 years. Cobb stared at the paper. He looked at Catherine. He looked at Beatrice, who gave him a thumbs up. "You're serious?" Cobb asked. "I'm the one who wrote the logistics code that saved the company $40 million last year, Arthur," Catherine said. "I know exactly what we can afford. Do we have a deal?" Cobb reached out a massive, calloused hand. Catherine took it firmly. "We have a deal, Ms. Sterling," Cobb said. "Damn, we should have been negotiating with you for 20 years. "Yes," Catherine smiled, looking out the window at the city that was finally, truly hers. "You should have." And that is how the billionaire who thought he was untouchable ended up on the street, while the wife he underestimated took the throne she built. It's a brutal lesson in karma. Be careful who you step on while you're climbing the ladder, because they might be the one holding it steady. Richard Sterling learned the hard way that arrogance is a loan with a very high interest rate, and eventually, the bill always comes due. What do you think? Was Catherine too harsh, leaving him with nothing? Or did Richard deserve every bit of that cold revenge? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please smash that like button, share this with a friend who loves drama, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.